So I have a congregant, dear congregant named Iris Merrick. And Iris has a company called Iris B Branding and Communications. And this is one of her latest creations.
Oh.
And it's a powerful and compelling and difficult creation.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, Michael, it reminds me of what you were teaching yesterday, that there are those who have died because of racial violence or police violence, and we don't remember their names. We may say many names, too many names, but we don't always remember all that have died in the full history. And so while some of the individuals were mentioned here remain very notable and very remembered, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Emmett Till, Mary Turner, there are many who are not. And we remain silent. We remain silent when we know their names. We remain silent when we don't remember their names. But this particular piece says silent no more. There's a crime, there's a silence, but we are not going to remain silent any longer. Michael, could you remind us of the young person we talked about yesterday? Could you name his name?
It was Jesse Thornton.
Jesse Thornton.
Yeah.
Jesse Thornton, yeah.
Jesse Thornton. May his memory be a blessing.
Yes.
And
yes.
May we do our part as we continue to prepare for these moments of remembrance and solidarity and mourning. May we continue to draw out those names. Let us not allow temporary ignorance to prohibit us from learning names of people that deserve to be mentioned. Absolutely essential that we do whatever we can to figure out who's out there who doesn't get named.
Right.
Unfortunately, the list grows, still growing.
Yes, it is.
And even in the last few weeks, it's been difficult to keep up with the number of names. That's a real tragedy. That's a tragedy amidst tragedies. But there's no reason for us to desist from the effort. We must stay with it and do our best to keep up. And do whatever we can to make sure that there aren't additional names.
Yes.
Reverend Ware, Michael, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm all right.
Good. Welcome to you and our colleagues. And please take us into prayer and solidarity and action. Thank you all for joining us in our ECRA circle of solidarity and mourning. Words aren't flowing very easily for me. Fortunately, you're on today, Michael. So
yeah, that's what they say.
Good hands.
This is part 2 of where we were yesterday. Again, stating the often forgotten names of racism. Part 2 is where we are today. And we do begin with Albert Williams. So we'll go with Fred and Mary Jane.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And this is the story of Albert Williams. June 20th, 1940. A group of white men, led by the local sheriff and the night marshal, abducted NAACP leader Albert Williams from his home in Brownsville, Tennessee. 3 days later, Mr. Williams' lifeless and brutalized body was found in the nearby Hatchie River. He was 31 years old.
In the months following the lynching of Albert Williams, up to 40 more Black families were permanently driven from the community under threats of violence from the white mob. African Americans who remained in Brownsville were prohibited from meeting in groups, even for church services. And 2 African American men were beaten to death after being arrested by the same night marshal who had helped to abduct Williams.
I believe our story from yesterday was also in June of 1940.
Right, it was, yeah.
Our June of 1940 then was in Alabama. Our June of 1940 here is in Brownsville, Tennessee. The comparison between these two stories is not only in their time, but in who led and who instigated their deaths. In both cases, as yesterday, it's same here, it is led by a local police officer. This case is the sheriff and the night marshal who were able to carry out this heinous crime. And in this particular case, you will note that there is no mention of this case even being bothered to be brought before any higher judicial court.
No.
Instead, what would end up happening is that he would just go down as another man, another black man in the annals of the black community, as someone whose life was taken and there was nothing. So what do you hear? What do you see? What do you think?
That was kind of before my time. Actually, I was born a year before that. But wasn't this thing that comes to my mind is, wasn't this when Ku Klux Klan were very, very active, prominent?
Yes, that is true. That is very true. And interesting that you mentioned that, because this in this particular case is one where the Ku Klux Klan, as its signature would be, is not even necessary. It wasn't even needed in Brownsville. They didn't need to. Everybody know who did it. Everybody knows what happened. The Ku Klux Klan, in its intensity, wanted to wear white, wanted to wear their coverings, so that the neighborhood community would not recognize who they were. It really wasn't about the black folks knowing who they were, but they wanted to be hidden so that their fellow neighbors would not be able to see who they were and what they were. But in this case, it didn't even matter. Brownsville, in this case, would also be, as you can see by the story, becomes a very intense spot to where it went from killing off an NAACP leader who was speaking about the injustices in that community to just basically telling the whole community that you cannot be here. So you either left, or you abided, or you died. It really wasn't, there was only three choices. You either left the community if you could not live into the white societal control, or you chose to remain and be obedient to the white rule, or you died. Those are your three choices for life.
Well, it just makes me feel devastated too. I mean, it's so horrific. I can't imagine this happening in the community I grew up in, and yet, I know my community didn't do anything about it either, so of course I wasn't born yet, but this stuff still happens today, obviously, and that's what raises the issue for me. Until we do something about it, it's not going to end. You still hear some people saying that there are not necessarily KKK, but white supremacist people in police departments, in the military, and this kind of thing still gets perpetuated, that our police departments are still white supremacist, and it's allowed to happen. We saw the first slide with all the names, and yeah, so this has to end. It's still going on to different degrees maybe, but the same thing. The white supremacy is dictating a kind of hierarchy that leaves black bodies vulnerable. So, I mean, it's horrific, and it's devastating, and it's unacceptable.
What troubles me, leaves me feeling a sense of brokenness inside, is how monstrous this behavior is by law enforcement.
Yes.
And how problematic it is that there's so much silence surrounding this monstrosity. To me, that is just as devastating as the evil perpetrated and far more insidious. White supremacy, to the extent that it is perpetrated and activated and pressed upon people by those filled with hatred or whatever else drives them, it's sort of an enemy that you can see in a way. And so you can respond to it directly. It's the silence and the invisibility and the disconnection of the rest of us who are not willing to perpetrate such monstrous acts, such evil acts, but don't really do anything about it. And so become accomplices, wittingly or not. And how do you live in a nation that espouses the dignity of all people and yet fails so horribly to live up to those aspirations? It just grieves me to no end. And I appreciate the opportunity ultimately to confess this, really, and to recognize that it's only one part here, to talk about things, to pray on things, but how do we actively break the silence? How do we actively, those of us who are not proximate, how do we get out of that? Where are our allies? Let us find them. Let us get close to them. Let us become an us in the fight against racism, in the fight for anti-racism. Let us not remain silent. Let us not be so overwhelmed and surprised and devastated and brokenhearted when so many have been living with this heart-shattering, breathtaking reality.
As you were speaking, it reminds me of ripples on the water from a pebble. And that these stories in the last 2 days were ripples in the water that floated across the Black community throughout the nation, silently, not in the public news, but for us, it was something that was known. And it set the tone to say, even today, why would you, as a Black man or woman or a Black child, be not fearful of the police? Why would you not be concerned about your own lives when this has been historically the way it has been? And what's sad is how you describe, Rabbi, how the silence remained then and how the silence has remained throughout our history. And so it does become a point of who are you going to go to? If the morality of those who see what's going on are willing to accept it and go along with it, then where do you turn? And it does create this sense of who's listening, who cares? And that's where we get these boiling points that happen. That's where we get the things that are going on in our community where we want to say, why are we protesting? Why are we doing this? Because there's a history of this going on. And this history has not been listened to, heard, or even cared about. I reflect on the fact that the NAACP office in Harlem in the 40s and 50s would hang a banner every time word of a lynching came. The underground would share it in Chicago. We would know about it in Los Angeles. We would know about it in every Black community when something happened. But no one else cared. No one else listened. And so when you ask why would we want to protest? Why would we be so concerned and fearful? Because this didn't just start last week. It's been going on for a historically long time. And in many ways, this is the worst, because we have to go back to that whole piece of enslaved Africa. This is the time when supposedly we're in a new age, Reconstruction, but yes, we are living in a time of Jim Crow. So yeah,
One thing, Michael, that is welling up in me is a rage.
Yeah.
Not just an anger, but a rage.
Mm.
A rage over the brutality and the inhumanity and the monstrosity. I also have questions, right? Questions of good cops out there,
Yeah.
even their good union representatives. What do they make of legacies like this? Legacies that historically law enforcement has contributed to creating, not by themselves.
Exactly.
We are part of a larger systemic problem here. But it would seem that we place these officers on the front lines and ask them to deal with a lot of things that maybe we're not courageous enough to deal with. And these are certain outcomes. And I wonder, the good people serving our communities and trying to protect us, when they and we come across narratives like this, how do we collectively take responsibility
Mm.
for turning this legacy in a different direction? In a direction of healing and wholeness and anti-racism? That's a big question. That's a big question for me. And it's a question I want to engage our officers in and those who represent them and everybody else. We have to get into these kinds of conversations and come to grips with the brutality
Yeah,
and to end it. Excuse me. Sorry, Fred.
no problem. Just along those lines, I'm thinking, is it more of a moral issue, an issue of the heart changing minds, or is it more of a legal policy issue of changing laws? I'm just reacting and reflecting on what you're trying to raise, I think, Rabbi, that, yeah, who are our allies? What really has to change to make this change? What does make the change?
So just as I think it was Craig who asked the question about the police and about the military, and white supremacy. And so I went to Annapolis, to the Naval Academy, for 2 years before I decided that was not to be my path. And one of the first clues that I had that I was not going to stay there was in the midst of plebe summer, when you didn't get any opportunity for recreation, certainly. One of the things that they did was to file us all into a great big auditorium to watch, I think the name of the movie was Tripoli. It was 1950, and it's, the Barbary Pirates. And I walked out, which, I was kind of in fear because you did not separate yourself from the crowd in that circumstance. But I was appalled at, I had never seen that film, but not just the film, but also like kind of the interactive audience, and just unnecessary violence. But also the film is, clearly it's about, us against them, othering brown people. I've never watched it since. I've never seen the end of it. I don't really care to, but I think that there's a lot of conditioning and a lot of kind of, if you're part of us, then like this is part of your ethos. And it's not necessarily about conversations, but certainly overt behaviors. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think you also have a military and a police force that are, there's, veterans enter police forces and so on and so forth. I think there is a conditioning, and I think like the example of Tripoli, not only in the sense of, being showed that as a midshipman in 1992, but also still what we get through the media. And we talk a lot right now about, fake news and about, messaging and things like that. But it's been going on forever that we're always getting messages.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think it is conditioning. I mean, we go back to this story here in an entire community that this is allowed to happen, and people become conditioned to that, just as we become conditioned and have been conditioned over many of things that's going on in our black brown communities, such as that we've been conditioned that they don't want to work. We've been conditioned to the fact that they don't want a good education. We've been conditioned not because that's the reality, but it's because what we put out there. We put out there so many messages, and so these messages become in themselves reality. And I think you are very right. And so our police and our military that's how you do what you do in this particular environment, especially when it relates to going to this sort of brutal madness. You are conditioned to that's okay, that it's us against them. And I was talking to a police officer the other day, and great person saying, yes, there are good cops and bad cops. And in the same conversation, I was being reminded that as a police officer, I'm also taught to trust no one. Think about that. If I'm walking the street, I'm to trust no one but my partner, right? So that means that everyone else is a threat. And how do I condition that? The only way I can condition the difference is by certain characteristics. So, and those characteristics are pretty well known in certain communities. That in the white community, I'm as a police officer, I will need to do less. But in the black community, I'm going to always be looked at as and that's not true. But because of that conditioning on by the police officer to always be in this sense, by the same token, that breeds itself into how you react in that black, brown, Latino community. It really does. So yeah, I agree with you, Jan, that it's a great deal of conditioning. And so the only way we're going to make it, the challenge for us is to make that change to unconditioned, which goes back to what we talked about partly yesterday, and we've been talking about all along, is education. And that's what this is about here, is being able to look back and say, listen, if we learn as that this sort of behavior is not something that was started last year or in the last 10 years, but it's been an ongoing behavior, it's going to take us a long time to uncondition that behavior.
Two other kind of just points. I think that in 1940, just again, back to the military for a second, I don't believe that African Americans, that black people could become officers. I think that after
absolutely not.
But I'm just saying, like, it's that's a message from our federal government. That's not something that, it's the South, or it's like, that's a recognition of kind of how someone was seen. And the other thing, and maybe I'll try to remember, I'll find this clip and send it to you, but it was some students interviewing, and they were interviewing like their campus police, and they were interviewing some police officers in the Bronx about basically like stupid stuff that kids do, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like some, minor vandalism, kind of drunken disorderly stuff, and just how those two forces, that the campus police knew that, like, well, kids are going to do shenanigans, right? And it's our job to like keep everybody safe and make sure that, they stay on their path. Whereas like the police officers in the Bronx had such diametrically opposed reactions to, the same scenario. What if, you saw a group of 18-year-olds doing X? And just that suspicion, or, whatever, is just so different based on the context.
And the point I was trying to make about the 1940s, though, Jane, I want to push back a little bit, is that what I'm talking about is the conditioning that was done by the white community within its own confines, that said that this sort of brutality was okay. That it wasn't even about whether a black man could be a police officer or not, but that a black body could be disposed of, gotten rid of. And there was going back to Rabbi's comment, that the white community voices were silent in these acts. And matter of fact, they were themselves conditioning themselves that it's okay. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan movie that would come out would have already been out by now. And so that whole sense of conditioning people that, black people were bad, and we need to get rid of them, and they're going to come and steal our white women, and it just all of that was conditioning itself. And so, but I'm saying that you're right. No, a black person was not going to become a police officer. What's interesting is that there were and could be black politicians in the South.
Yeah.
And there were, right? There were in Alabama and Mississippi, and that's strange but then that mentality, by the way, changed at the tail end of Reconstruction, going into Jim Crow, and all those black legislators were kicked out.
Yeah.
But just so you know, there were no black police officers. You could be a politician, you could be a lawyer, but they weren't going to let you be a police officer.
I think the messaging you're talking about too, Michael, is, I was just thinking of that too, the birth of a nation movement.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get in my head. Yeah.
Yeah, it was only like a decade or so before this. And
Before this.
Screened in the White House by, I think, Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow.
Yeah, so I mean, that was a huge messaging thing.
Yeah.
Well, this is also the era when a lot of the Confederate statues were put up. I mean, those are not historical. Those, I mean, they're from a later period. So I mean, there are those waves that you're talking about where essentially the black community was made invisible again.
Right. I would love to see your video as one of our sessions, as a matter of fact, if you find it. I know you said sending it to us, but I'd love for us to see it together as a family. So I'm going to ask you, Jane, if you would read our prayer this morning.
You hold time within your hands and see it all, from beginning to end. Please keep and carry these precious people in their sadness and loss. Cover them with your great wings of love. Give their weary hearts rest and their minds sound sleep. Lord, lift their eyes so that they may catch a glimpse of eternity and be comforted by the promise of heaven. We ask all this in the precious name of our God.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
I'm going to do it to you again. We're going to have a song. This song is also by Marvin Gaye from 1971 album. And again, I'm going to ask you, as I did yesterday, to listen to the lyrics and pay attention to what you see. And we'll talk when we have completed the video. Friends, what did you see? What did you hear?
What I saw at the end, which I guess it struck me, was blacks are always together in a group, whether it was the picnic or the walking or the playing basketball and maybe when was that written, or when were those pictures?
The song was written in 1971. Both songs from that you heard are from the same album in 1971. Okay. The videos, however, were made later. In 1971, we were not doing music videos to songs. And so the videos were taken and spliced together later to reflect the time period. So the videos are reflective of the time period of 1971, but they were added together. I see.
Okay. And the videos were similar to yesterday, I think.
They almost were. I want to know they almost were. Did you notice a difference? Did anybody notice it?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that it was, the beginning was more like yesterday, I think, and then towards the end they moved to the lakefront.
Yes. I was wondering where they pick it up, yeah.
Seemed like people that were dressed a little better, and having their picnics together. And, the lakefront just gives a different feeling of a little upgrade or something there, you know. But what's going on? Yeah, that was such an iconic song, and it's such beautiful music, soulful music, but also reflecting a kind of a sadness too, you know, that could contrast those storefronts and those neighborhoods in the beginning with the lakefront later on, and feel a kind of a hope, and the words of the song too, that you know, we're all about love and understanding, and how can we get past the violence that we're feeling in our communities. Those are the things that stuck out for me.
Rabbi, you were going to say something.
Much like yesterday's video, I saw poverty and vulnerability, but I also saw signs of resilience. Yesterday, I saw two men looking at each other with a smile on their faces, presumably in a context of friendship and connection. Today, I saw families together, living their lives within that vulnerability. I saw other ways in which Black community seeks resilience or seeks to respond or seeks to cope. I saw that in religious symbols. I saw that in gang insignias on walls. I think that's a response. And for those involved, a meaningful response to vulnerability, to powerlessness. I saw a child running across a park, perhaps somewhat free of the complexities his parents and grandparents live. I felt I saw a big picture, although much of it on the outside looked vulnerable and impoverished, at least economically.
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to say is that we should be careful about what looks impoverished,
Absolutely.
what looks vulnerable, what lacks resilience. Yeah, I see all those things in one picture here. And I'm trying to feel empathy. I thought the videos helped convey empathy. And of course, as I mentioned yesterday, I really adore Marvin Gaye, and he brings this beauty and this moral curiosity to bear in such a prophetic way.
Yesterday's message with the inner city blues and the poem we read at Black Rage and loss of life, as we talked about Jesse Thornton, were all connectional in this sense of despair and rage. That is true. Today, as we look at what's going on, is, and what I love about the lyrics of this song is that we're being asked to talk to one another. The key here is, come on and talk to me so you can see what's going on. And so often that's what we don't do. We don't talk. We sometimes we react, or we act without ever finding out if that's what is needed or necessary or desired. And what was profound about those lyrics then and still profound today is those lyrics are still true. Talk to me. Let's have a conversation. Let's try to figure out what is really going on here. And then we can find middle ground. We can't find middle ground if you are going to use mob mentality to lynch me and to push me aside, and you won't even engage in conversation. One of the things I heard as we were talking was this sense of how when Albert Williams was lynched, how this mob did their thing, but no one talked about it. No one engaged it. No one stepped up. And even now, as we look at what's going on in our nation, we still have government who don't want to have a conversation. The President of the United States does not want to have a conversation about race. That is sad. And here we are in 2020, and the President of the United States can't even sit down and have a conversation, an honest, God forbid, conversation about race. because we don't want to talk about it. We want to push it aside and we want to act as if it wasn't there. You should know, by the way, that this particular song did not really make the top 10 when it came out. It didn't become the song that it is now, that it's been recognized for the last, I'd say 30 or 40 years now, since it was actually written. When it first came out, it was just a song on an album. And it was just a song that was put out there. But the more it was played within the context of the Black community, we realized, wait a minute, he's talking to us. And he's talking about our experience. And he's talking to anyone who will listen. Come and talk to me. Come and see what's going on. Come and be a part of this. And I found very interesting that the two videos, by the way, are shot in two different locations. The one yesterday was shot in Harlem. It was done. That's Harlem. I want to be sure, Mary J. I had to go look it up to be sure. But it was. It's Harlem. But this one is Detroit and Chicago. Mm-hmm. Detroit and Chicago. And when I saw this video first, by the way, and I said, wow, Chicago. I'm wondering if we will pick that up when we watch this video. And that area where the kids are playing is in that Cabrini Green area. They didn't show the high rises. They showed the south side greenery area along the lake, but you didn't see because Cabrini Green would have still been here during this footage. But yes, so I found both very profound. I find Marvin, as you've said, very profound, and I find this conversation around what do we do with this? And for me, the takeaway for me with this is the sense that we've started something now with what's going on with our protests. But we can't stop having conversations. We can't stop talking. We can't put it down now and say, okay, we're good, because that's typically what we do. All of us, I'm going to claim that. All of us typically do that. We put it down. But we can't stop the fight now. We got to stay in it, and we got to keep finding ways to talk. If our president won't talk, so be it. But we need to talk amongst each other. We need to get our communities moving, and we need to do the work that needs to be done. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Michael, thank you.
Our closing piece was very simply this quote, which has meaning because of Jackie Robinson. Okay. And it says, life is not a spectator sport. If you're going to spend your whole life in the grandstands just watching what goes on, which I thought went with our song, in my opinion, you're wasting your life.
Perfect.
Amen.
Amen.
That's our morning.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you.
Friends, just like Reverend Ware says, we must struggle on, must stay in the fight. Maybe a little voting reform along the way.
Would be nice.
And some police reforms along the way. I'm understating, of course. These are essential improvements. We need a moral revival, as Reverend Barber talks about. And we need that around race and anti-racism, but voting reform would help us move that conversation forward for real. Police reforms, particularly the allocation of force, doing that in a way that has less lethal outcomes, to put it mildly and starkly, would help us push that struggle forward. Well done, Michael.
Thank you.
You did great. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you
for engaging us. We're engaging each other in dialogue and exalted purpose. But we got to keep at it. Got to keep at it.
Amen.
All right then. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
All right. Peace.
All righty.
Bye. I'll look at the- Bye now.
Thanks.